Commander Sarah Chen adjusted her crisp naval uniform one final time before stepping out of her rental car at the Newport Naval Academy. The morning sun glinted off the polished buttons of her dress blues, but she had deliberately chosen to wear only her basic officer insignia, a simple lieutenant's bars, instead of the stars and anchors that would normally adorn her collar. Today was different. Today, she was conducting an undercover evaluation of the Academy's training protocols, specifically focusing on how junior officers and cadets interacted with what they perceived to be lower-ranking personnel. The mission had come directly from the Pentagon after several concerning reports about discrimination and unprofessional conduct at various naval installations. Sarah had spent 15 years climbing the ranks of the U.S. Navy, earning her position through countless deployments, strategic victories, and unwavering dedication to her service. At 38, she commanded respect across the entire Pacific Fleet, but today she would see how she was treated when people assumed she was just another lieutenant passing through. The Academy's main courtyard buzzed with activity. Cadets in their pristine white uniforms marched in formation while instructors barked orders from the sidelines. Sarah walked purposefully toward the administrative building, her trained eye automatically cataloging everything she observed. The facility looked impressive from the outside, but she had learned long ago that appearances could be deceiving. As she approached the main entrance, a group of senior cadets blocked her path. Their leader, a tall young man with perfectly groomed hair and an arrogant smirk, stepped forward. His name tag read Cadet Morrison, and the way he carried himself suggested someone accustomed to getting his way. "Excuse me, Lieutenant," Morrison said, his voice dripping with condescension as he glanced at her collar insignia. "I don't think you belong here. This is a restricted area for senior personnel only." Sarah maintained her composure, though internally she noted the cadet's immediate assumption of authority over someone he believed to be his superior, even if only by a small margin. "I have business inside," she replied calmly. "I'm here for the quarterly evaluation meeting." Morrison's smirk widened, and his companions chuckled behind him. "Listen, sweetheart," he said, the endearment delivered like an insult. "I've been at this academy for 3 years. I know everyone who's supposed to be at those meetings, and you're definitely not on the list." The casual sexism wasn't lost on Sarah. She had encountered it countless times throughout her career, but it never failed to disappoint her, especially coming from someone who was supposed to represent the future of naval leadership. She pulled out her official orders, extending them toward Morrison. "Perhaps you should check these before making assumptions," she said, her voice steady but with an edge that hinted at the authority she truly wielded. Morrison barely glanced at the papers before waving them away dismissively. "Anyone can fake documents these days. Besides, what kind of real officer shows up to an important meeting dressed like a basic lieutenant? If you were actually important, you'd be wearing the right insignia." The other cadets laughed, emboldened by their leader's behavior. One of them, a shorter cadet with nervous eyes, seemed uncomfortable with the situation but said nothing. Sarah filed away that observation for later. "You know what I think?" Morrison continued, stepping closer in what was clearly meant to be an intimidating gesture. "I think you're some kind of reporter or activist trying to sneak in and cause trouble. We've been warned about people like you." Sarah's expression remained neutral, but her mind was racing. The cadet's behavior was far worse than anything described in the initial reports. His willingness to not only disregard proper military protocol, but to physically intimidate a superior officer suggested a deep-seated problem with the Academy's disciplinary standards. "I suggest you step aside and allow me to proceed with my authorized business," Sarah said, her voice taking on the unmistakable tone of command that had once silenced an entire carrier deck during a crisis in the South China Sea. But Morrison was too caught up in his own sense of power to recognize the danger signs. "Or what? You'll report me to someone who actually matters? Look around, Lieutenant. This is my territory. These are my people, No one's going to take the word of some random officer who can't even dress appropriately for a meeting. The situation was escalating beyond what Sarah had expected for her first hour at the academy. She had planned to observe quietly, take notes, and compile a comprehensive report. Instead, she found herself face to face with exactly the kind of toxic leadership behavior that was poisoning military culture. Captain James Rodriguez emerged from the administrative building at that moment, his weathered face scanning the courtyard as he made his routine morning rounds. He was the academy's commanding officer, a man Sarah knew by reputation as someone who ran a tight ship and demanded excellence from his cadets. Morrison noticed Rodriguez approaching, and his demeanor changed instantly. The arrogant cadet transformed into a model of military bearing, snapping to attention with practiced precision. His companions followed suit, their previous swagger replaced by nervous formality. "Sir," Morrison called out, "we have a situation here. This woman is attempting to gain unauthorized access to the restricted areas of the academy." Rodriguez's eyes swept over the scene, taking in Sarah's uniform, the gathered cadets, and the obvious tension in the air. His expression was unreadable as he approached, his boots clicking sharply against the concrete. "What seems to be the problem here?" Rodriguez asked, his voice carrying the authority of decades in service. Morrison straightened even further, if that were possible. "Sir, this lieutenant claims she has business in the administrative building, but she's not on any of the authorized lists for today's meetings. When I asked for proper identification, she became confrontational and refused to comply with security protocols." Sarah watched Rodriguez carefully as Morrison spoke, noting the subtle changes in the captain's expression. She could see him processing the situation, weighing the cadet's words against what he was observing. "Lieutenant," Rodriguez addressed Sarah directly. "May I see your orders?" Sarah handed over her documentation without hesitation. Rodriguez examined the papers carefully, his eyes widening slightly as he read. She watched him process the information, seeing the exact moment when recognition dawned. "These orders are signed by Admiral Patterson himself," Rodriguez said slowly, his voice carefully controlled. "They authorize a fleet-level inspection of this facility." Morrison's face went pale. "Sir, that can't be right. She's just a lieutenant." Rodriguez turned to face the cadet, his expression hardening. "Cadet Morrison, are you questioning the validity of orders signed by a fleet admiral?" "No, sir." "But are you suggesting that you know better than the admiral's office who should and shouldn't be conducting inspections at this facility?" Morrison's confidence crumbled visibly. "No, sir. I just thought—" "You thought wrong." Rodriguez cut him off sharply. "Your first mistake was assuming that rank insignia tells the whole story. Your second mistake was failing to show proper respect to any fellow officer, regardless of their apparent rank. Your third mistake was creating a scene that reflects poorly on this academy and everyone in it." Sarah remained silent, allowing the captain to handle his cadet. This was exactly the kind of teaching moment that could either reinforce proper military values or perpetuate the toxic culture she was here to investigate. "But sir," Morrison protested weakly, "how was I supposed to know?" "She's wearing lieutenant's bars." "That's not the point, cadet," Rodriguez replied firmly. "The point is that you failed to follow proper protocol. When someone presents official orders, you verify them through appropriate channels. You don't make unilateral decisions based on assumptions." The other cadets shuffled nervously, sensing that they might face consequences for their participation in the confrontation. The shorter cadet, who had seemed uncomfortable earlier, took a small step back, trying to distance himself from Morrison. Rodriguez turned back to Sarah, his demeanor becoming more respectful. "Lieutenant, I apologize for this incident. Please allow me to escort you to the administrative building personally." Sarah nodded graciously. "Thank you, Captain. I appreciate your intervention." As they walked away from the stunned cadets, Rodriguez spoke quietly. "I have to ask, Lieutenant, Those orders mention a fleet-level inspection, but they don't specify your actual position. May I inquire about your role in this evaluation?" Sarah smiled slightly, the first genuine expression she had shown since arriving at the academy. "Let's just say that Admiral Patterson takes these matters very seriously, Captain. And so do I." Rodriguez nodded, but she could see the questions forming in his mind. He was clearly a competent officer who understood that there was more to this situation than met the eye. Behind them, Morrison stood frozen in place, finally beginning to grasp that he might have made a catastrophic error in judgment. His companions had already begun to scatter, unwilling to be associated with what was rapidly becoming a career-defining moment for all the wrong reasons. Sarah made mental notes as they walked, cataloging every detail of the encounter. Morrison's behavior was symptomatic of larger problems, but Rodriguez's response suggested that not everyone at the academy had lost sight of proper military values. The real test would come later, when she revealed her true identity and rank. She wondered how many more Morrisons she would encounter before this evaluation was complete, and whether the academy's leadership was truly committed to the changes that were clearly needed. Inside the administrative building, Captain Rodriguez led Sarah through a maze of corridors lined with portraits of distinguished naval officers. The walls told the story of the Academy's proud history, but Sarah was more interested in its present problems. "The quarterly evaluation meeting is in Conference Room A," Rodriguez explained as they walked. "We'll be reviewing training protocols, disciplinary actions, and performance metrics. I assume that's what brings you here today?" Sarah nodded, maintaining her cover while mentally preparing for what she might discover. "Among other things, Captain, there have been some concerns raised at the fleet level about certain aspects of Academy operations." Rodriguez's expression tightened slightly. "May I ask what specific concerns?" "Leadership development primarily. Questions about whether the Academy is producing officers who truly understand the values and responsibilities of command." They paused outside Conference Room A, and Rodriguez turned to face her directly. "Lieutenant, I've been running this academy for 8 years. I've seen thousands of cadets pass through these halls. Most of them go on to serve with distinction, but I won't pretend we don't have challenges." "What kind of challenges?" Sarah asked, genuinely interested in his perspective. Rodriguez glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard. "Between you and me, some of these cadets come from backgrounds where they've never been told no. They arrive thinking their family connections or financial status will carry them through. Breaking them of those assumptions while still building their confidence as future leaders, it's a delicate balance." Sarah appreciated his honesty, but she also noted that he hadn't mentioned the gender and racial dynamics she had already witnessed. "And how do you address those situations?" "Discipline, accountability, and constant reinforcement of naval values," Rodriguez replied firmly. "But it's an ongoing process. Some cadets adapt quickly, others take more time, and unfortunately, some never get it at all." Before Sarah could respond, the conference room door opened and several officers emerged. Among them was Commander Patricia Walsh, the Academy's Deputy Director of Training, and Lieutenant Commander Michael Torres, who supervised the advanced tactical programs. "Captain Rodriguez," Commander Walsh called out, "we're ready to begin." Rodriguez gestured for Sarah to precede him into the room. "Commander Walsh, Lieutenant Commander Torres, I'd like you to meet Lieutenant Chen. She's here from Fleet Headquarters for today's evaluation." Commander Walsh extended her hand with a professional smile. "Welcome to Newport, Lieutenant. I'm always pleased to meet officers from the fleet level. It helps us stay connected to operational realities." Sarah shook her hand, immediately sensing that Walsh was cut from different cloth than Cadet Morrison. There was genuine respect in her demeanor, regardless of Sarah's apparent junior rank. Lieutenant Commander Torres was more reserved but equally professional. "Lieutenant, what's your background? Have you worked in training environments before?" I've had some experience with personnel development, Sarah replied carefully. I'm particularly interested in how leadership skills are cultivated in academy settings. The meeting that followed was revealing in ways Sarah hadn't expected. The three senior officers discussed training challenges with remarkable candor, apparently viewing her as a trusted colleague, despite her supposed junior status. Their concerns aligned closely with the intelligence she had received at the Pentagon. Our biggest challenge, Commander Walsh explained, is the disconnect between theoretical knowledge and practical application. These cadets can recite regulations perfectly, but when faced with real leadership situations, some of them revert to behaviors that are completely inconsistent with naval values. Lieutenant Commander Torres nodded in agreement. We've implemented additional ethics training, increased mentorship programs, and strengthened our peer leadership initiatives. But frankly, some of the problems run deeper than what we can address in a 4-year program. Can you be more specific? Sarah asked. Rodriguez leaned forward. We're seeing cadets who understand that discrimination and harassment are against regulations, but they don't genuinely believe it applies to them. They view rules as obstacles to navigate rather than principles to embrace. Sarah thought immediately of Morrison's behavior earlier that morning. Have there been specific incidents? The three senior officers exchanged glances. Commander Walsh spoke first. Nothing that's made it into official reports, but there have been concerning patterns. Subtle behaviors that are difficult to document but collectively create a hostile environment for certain groups. Female cadets, primarily, Torres added, and cadets from minority backgrounds. It's not overt enough to trigger formal disciplinary action, but it's persistent enough to affect performance and retention. Sarah felt a familiar anger rising in her chest. These were the same issues she had faced throughout her own career, and clearly they were being perpetuated rather than addressed. What steps have been taken to address these patterns? Rodriguez's expression grew troubled. We've increased diversity training, implemented anonymous reporting systems, and tried to foster a more inclusive culture. But change is slow, and some of the resistance comes from cadets who view any emphasis on inclusion as an attack on tradition. The conversation continued for another hour, with Sarah asking probing questions and taking careful notes. It became clear that the Academy's leadership was aware of the problems, but struggled with effective solutions. Their good intentions were undermined by a cadet culture that had grown increasingly toxic despite their efforts. As the meeting concluded, Sarah excused herself to conduct additional observations around the campus. She wanted to see more of the day-to-day interactions between cadets and faculty before drawing any final conclusions. Her next stop was the mess hall during the lunch period. The large dining facility buzzed with activity as hundreds of cadets gathered for their midday meal. Sarah obtained her tray and found a seat where she could observe without drawing attention. The segregation was subtle but unmistakable. Male cadets clustered together at tables in the center of the room, their conversations loud and boisterous. Female cadets tended to sit in smaller groups along the perimeter, their discussions more subdued. Cadets of color were even more isolated, often eating alone or in very small clusters. Sarah watched as Morrison entered the mess hall with his usual entourage. His earlier encounter hadn't diminished his swagger. If anything, he seemed even more eager to assert his dominance. He surveyed the room like a predator selecting prey, his gaze settling on a table where three female cadets sat quietly eating their lunch. "Ladies," Morrison announced as he approached their table, his voice carrying across the nearby area. "You're sitting in our usual spot." One of the female cadets, a petite Asian-American woman with sergeant's stripes, looked up calmly. "I don't see any reserved signs, Morrison. And last I checked, the mess hall was open seating." Morrison's smirk widened. "Come on, Chen. Don't make this difficult. You know how things work around here." Sarah noted the irony of the cadet's surname matching her own cover identity, but she was more focused on the dynamics playing out before her. The female cadet, apparently named Chen, was holding her ground despite being outnumbered. "What I know," Cadet Chen replied firmly, "is that harassment based on gender is a violation of the Cadet Honor Code. So unless you have official business here, I suggest you find somewhere else to eat." Morrison's companions laughed, but there was an edge of nervousness to their amusement. They clearly sensed the situation escalating beyond casual intimidation. "Harassment?" Morrison's voice rose. "Who said anything about harassment? I'm just asking politely for you to relocate. Unless you think you're too good to show some courtesy to your fellow cadets." Other cadets in the mess hall were beginning to notice the confrontation. Some watched with obvious discomfort, while others seemed entertained by the drama. Sarah was dismayed by how few intervened or even seemed inclined to support the female cadets. Cadet Chen stood up slowly, her posture radiating the kind of calm confidence that Sarah recognized in effective military leaders. "Morrison, you've made your request. I've declined. Unless you plan to escalate this to an official complaint, I suggest you move along." "Maybe I will file a complaint," Morrison shot back. "Insubordination, failure to respect senior cadets, creating a hostile environment. I'm sure I can think of something that sticks." Sarah had heard enough. She rose from her table and walked over to the confrontation, her lieutenant's bars visible as she approached. The nearest cadets noticed her first, their conversations dying as they recognized an officer entering the situation. "Is there a problem here?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to command. Morrison turned toward her, and his face went pale as he recognized the lieutenant who had caused him trouble earlier that morning. "Ma'am, no problem. Just a minor disagreement about seating arrangements." "Cadet Morrison," Sarah said, using his name deliberately to ensure he understood she remembered their previous encounter. "Are you familiar with the regulation regarding harassment and intimidation of fellow service members?" "Yes, ma'am," Morrison replied. His earlier confidence completely evaporated. "And do you believe your current behavior is consistent with those regulations?" Morrison glanced around nervously, suddenly aware that the entire mess hall was watching. "Ma'am, I was just asking them to move. It wasn't harassment." Sarah turned to Cadet Chen. "Is that your understanding of what happened here?" Cadet Chen met her gaze directly. "Ma'am." Cadet Morrison demanded that we vacate our table without any justification beyond his preference for this location. When I declined, he threatened to file false charges against me. "I see." Sarah looked back at Morrison. "Cadet, you have two choices. You can apologize to these officers for your inappropriate behavior and find somewhere else to eat. Or you can explain to Captain Rodriguez why you're continuing to demonstrate poor judgment despite this morning's counseling session." The threat was clear, and Morrison's remaining defiance crumbled. "Yes, ma'am. I apologize for any misunderstanding." He turned to leave, but Sarah wasn't finished. "Cadet Morrison." "Ma'am." "This is twice in one day that you've demonstrated behavior inconsistent with naval leadership. I strongly suggest you use the remainder of today to reflect on whether you truly understand what it means to be an officer in the United States Navy." Morrison nodded rapidly. "Yes, ma'am. Understood." As he and his companions hastily departed, Sarah turned back to the female cadets. "Are you all right?" Cadet Chen smiled genuinely for the first time. "Thank you for intervening, ma'am. Unfortunately, this kind of thing happens more often than it should." "How often?" Sarah asked. "Weekly, at least. Sometimes daily. It's usually subtle enough that it's hard to prove, but the pattern is clear." Sarah felt her anger building again. The Academy's leadership might be well-intentioned, but they were clearly failing to create an environment where all cadets could thrive. The toxic culture wasn't just a few bad actors. It was a systemic problem that required immediate attention. As she left the mess hall, Sarah made a decision. Her original plan had been to complete the evaluation quietly and submit her report through official channels. But what she had witnessed demanded more direct action. It was time to reveal her true identity and rank. The Academy needed to understand that fleet-level leadership was taking these issues seriously, and that real consequences would follow if meaningful changes weren't implemented immediately. The question was whether Captain Rodriguez and his team would rise to the challenge, or whether the Academy would require more dramatic intervention to correct its course. That evening, Sarah requested a private meeting with Captain Rodriguez in his office. The sun was setting over Newport Harbor, casting long shadows across the Academy grounds as she knocked on his door. "Come in," Rodriguez called out. He looked up from his paperwork as Sarah entered, noting her serious expression. "Lieutenant Chen, how did the rest of your evaluation go today?" Sarah closed the door behind her and took a seat across from his desk. "Captain, before we continue, there's something important I need to share with you." Rodriguez set down his pen, giving her his full attention. "I'm listening." Sarah reached into her briefcase and pulled out a leather case containing her true rank insignia. She opened it slowly, revealing the stars and anchors that marked her as a fleet commander. Rodriguez's eyes widened as he processed what he was seeing. "Captain Rodriguez," Sarah said formally, "I am Fleet Commander Sarah Chen, commanding officer of the Pacific Fleet's 3rd Naval Squadron. I'm here conducting a comprehensive evaluation of Academy training protocols on direct orders from Admiral Patterson." Rodriguez shot to his feet, snapping to attention. "Ma'am, I apologize for—" "At ease, Captain," Sarah interrupted gently. "You have nothing to apologize for. Your conduct today has been exemplary. Please sit down. We have important matters to discuss." Rodriguez slowly returned to his chair, his expression a mixture of embarrassment and concern. "Commander, if I had known your true rank—" "You would have treated me exactly as you did today," Sarah finished, "with professionalism and respect. That's precisely why I conducted this evaluation undercover. I needed to see how cadets and staff interact when they think no one important is watching." She leaned forward, her expression growing serious. "Captain, what I witnessed today confirms our worst fears about the culture developing at this academy. The behavior I observed from Cadet Morrison and others represents a fundamental failure of leadership development." Rodriguez's face darkened. "Commander, Morrison's behavior this morning was completely unacceptable. I intended to have him written up for—" "It's not just Morrison," Sarah interrupted. "He's a symptom of a much larger problem. The segregation in your mess hall, the patterns of harassment that your own officers described, the tolerance for subtle discrimination. These issues are creating officers who view command as an opportunity for personal power rather than service leadership." She pulled out her tablet and began scrolling through her notes. "In my 6 hours on this campus, I witnessed 3 separate incidents of gender-based harassment, 2 instances of racial microaggressions, and countless examples of cadets who believe rank gives them the right to abuse those they perceive as inferior." Rodriguez winced. "Commander, we've been working to address these issues. The additional training programs, the mentorship initiatives, are insufficient," Sarah said firmly. "Captain, I've commanded ships in combat zones where lives depended on every officer's ability to lead effectively, regardless of their background or the backgrounds of those they command. The attitudes I saw today would get people killed in operational environments." She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the academy grounds where cadets were engaged in evening training exercises. "Do you know what my biggest concern is, Captain?" "No, ma'am." "It's not the cadets like Morrison who are obviously problematic. Those individuals can be identified and either corrected or removed. My biggest concern is the cadets who watched his behavior and said nothing. The ones who laughed along or simply looked away. They're learning that toxic leadership is acceptable as long as it's not directed at them personally. Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment. "What do you recommend, Commander?" Sarah turned back to face him. "Immediate and comprehensive reform. Starting tomorrow, I want every cadet and faculty member assembled for a mandatory leadership seminar. Not a lecture about regulations, but a genuine examination of what it means to serve others rather than oneself." She began pacing, her command presence now fully evident. "I want Morrison and his closest associates placed under formal review. Not just disciplinary action, but intensive remedial leadership training. If they can't demonstrate genuine change in their attitudes and behaviors within 30 days, they should be separated from the program." "That could be career-ending for them," Rodriguez pointed out. "Good," Sarah replied without hesitation. "Better to end the careers of unsuitable officers now than to let them poison entire units later. Captain, we're not doing these young people any favors by graduating them if they're not truly prepared to lead." Rodriguez nodded slowly. "What else?" "I want a complete review of your evaluation criteria. Academic performance and physical fitness aren't enough. We need robust assessment of character, integrity, and the ability to create inclusive environments where all service members can excel." Sarah returned to her chair and fixed Rodriguez with an intense stare. "Most importantly, I want to see accountability at every level. When faculty members observe inappropriate behavior and fail to address it, there need to be consequences. When senior cadets abuse their positions, there need to be consequences. When anyone in this institution tolerates discrimination or harassment, there need to be consequences." "Understood, Commander. But I have to ask, what about the positive aspects of the Academy? Surely not everything you observed today was negative." Sarah's expression softened slightly. "You're right, Captain. I was impressed by Cadet Chen's composure and integrity in the mess hall. Your own leadership team demonstrated genuine concern for these issues, even if their current approaches aren't sufficient. And your immediate response to Morrison's behavior this morning showed that you understand proper military standards." She pulled out another folder from her briefcase. "That's why I'm recommending that you remain in command of this academy, but with enhanced support and oversight. Admiral Patterson is prepared to assign additional resources, including diversity and inclusion specialists, leadership development experts, and reformed curriculum materials." Rodriguez looked relieved, but still concerned. "What kind of timeline are we looking at for these changes?" "Implementation begins immediately," Sarah said decisively. "I'll be extending my stay here for the next 2 weeks to oversee the initial phase of reforms. After that, there will be quarterly evaluations until we see sustained improvement." She stood again, preparing to leave. "Captain, I want you to understand something. This isn't about political correctness or social engineering. This is about military effectiveness. Our nation's security depends on having officers who can lead diverse teams under pressure, who can earn respect through competence and character rather than intimidation and privilege." "Yes, ma'am. I understand completely." "Good. Now, I need you to arrange for Cadet Morrison to be brought to your office tomorrow morning at 800 hours. It's time he learned exactly who he was so disrespectful to earlier today." Rodriguez winced. "That's going to be a difficult conversation for him." "It should be," Sarah replied firmly. "If he's going to become the kind of officer we need, he has to confront the reality of his behavior and its consequences." The next morning, Morrison stood at rigid attention in Captain Rodriguez's office, his face pale and his hands trembling slightly. Rodriguez had briefed him only that he was meeting with a senior officer regarding his conduct without revealing the true identity of his visitor. When Sarah entered the office wearing her proper insignia, the stars and anchors of a fleet commander, Morrison's knees nearly buckled. The realization of exactly how catastrophically he had misjudged the situation hit him like a physical blow. "Cadet Morrison," Sarah said, her voice carrying the full authority of her rank and position. "Do you know who I am?" Ma'am, Morrison stammered. Fleet Commander Chen, ma'am. That's correct. I am the officer you disrespected yesterday morning, the officer whose orders you questioned and whose authority you dismissed. I command over 15,000 sailors and officers, including several who would be your superiors if you managed to graduate from this academy. Morrison's face had gone from pale to ashen. Ma'am, I had no idea. I thought... You thought what, cadet? Sarah's voice was dangerously quiet. You thought that someone wearing lieutenant's bars couldn't possibly deserve your respect? You thought that your 3 years at this academy gave you the authority to determine who belonged here and who didn't? No, ma'am, I made a terrible mistake. Sarah walked slowly around Morrison as he stood at attention, her boots clicking against the floor. Yes, you did. You made several terrible mistakes, but the worst one wasn't disrespecting me personally. The worst one was demonstrating that you fundamentally misunderstand what it means to be an officer in the United States Navy. She stopped directly in front of him. An officer leads by example, Cadet Morrison. An officer treats every person under their command with dignity and respect. An officer understands that true authority comes from competence, character, and the willingness to serve something greater than oneself. Morrison's voice was barely a whisper. Yes, ma'am. You've spent 3 years at this academy, and you still believe that leadership means intimidating those you perceive as weak or different. You still think that your position gives you the right to abuse others rather than the responsibility to protect and develop them. Sarah moved to stand behind Rodriguez's desk, her bearing unmistakably commanding. I'm going to give you a choice, Cadet Morrison. You can accept immediate dismissal from this academy with a notation in your record that will prevent you from ever holding a leadership position in any branch of military service. Morrison's breathing became rapid and shallow. Or, Sarah continued, you can commit to a comprehensive remediation program designed to help you understand what naval leadership actually requires. 30 days of intensive training, counseling, and evaluation. If you successfully complete the program and demonstrate genuine change in your attitudes and behavior, you'll be allowed to continue your studies. If you fail or show any indication that you're simply going through the motions, you'll be dismissed permanently. Morrison struggled to find his voice. Ma'am, what would the program involve? You'll be mentored directly by Commander Walsh and Lieutenant Commander Torres. You'll spend time with diverse units throughout the fleet, learning from officers who've succeeded despite facing the same prejudices you've been perpetuating. You'll study the histories of naval leaders who broke barriers and expanded opportunities for others. Sarah's expression remained stern. Most importantly, you'll be required to make amends to every cadet you've harassed or intimidated. Not empty apologies, but genuine efforts to understand the impact of your behavior and to actively work toward creating a more inclusive environment. And if I complete all of that successfully, then you'll have taken the first step toward becoming the kind of officer our Navy needs, Sarah replied. But understand, Cadet Morrison, this isn't just about saving your own career. Every officer who graduates from this academy will eventually be responsible for the lives and well-being of hundreds or thousands of service members. If you can't learn to value and develop all of those people regardless of their backgrounds, you have no business wearing this uniform. Morrison was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with the magnitude of the choice before him. Finally, he spoke. Ma'am, I choose the remediation program. I want to learn. I want to do better. Sarah studied him carefully, searching for any sign of insincerity. Very well, but understand that this is your only second chance. There won't be a third. Yes, ma'am, I understand. Report to Commander Walsh at 0600 tomorrow morning. Your academic schedule is suspended for the next 30 days while you focus entirely on leadership development. And Cadet Morrison. Yes, ma'am? The measure of whether you've learned anything won't be what you say or write in your evaluation reports. It will be how you treat the most junior person you encounter every single day for the rest of your career. 3 months later, Sarah returned to the academy for her quarterly follow-up evaluation. The changes were immediately apparent. The mess hall showed genuine integration, with mixed groups of cadets sharing tables and conversations. Female cadets and cadets of color moved through the facility with confidence rather than caution. In the courtyard where she had first encountered Morrison, she watched current interactions between cadets and faculty. Respect was evident in both directions, and she observed several instances of senior cadets actively mentoring their junior colleagues. Morrison himself had successfully completed his remediation program, though he would remain under close observation for the remainder of his time at the academy. More importantly, his public transformation had sent a clear message to other cadets about the consequences of toxic behavior and the possibilities for genuine change. During her final meeting with Captain Rodriguez, Sarah reviewed the comprehensive data on academy culture improvements. Harassment complaints had dropped by 70%. Retention rates among female cadets and cadets of color had improved significantly, and peer evaluations showed measurably better leadership behaviors across all class levels. "You've done excellent work, Captain," Sarah told Rodriguez as they concluded their review. "The changes here will have positive impacts throughout the fleet for decades to come." "Thank you, Commander, but I think we both know this was just the beginning. Maintaining these improvements will require constant vigilance and ongoing commitment." Sarah nodded. "That's true of any meaningful change, but you've proven that transformation is possible when leadership is genuinely committed to doing what's right rather than what's easy." As she prepared to leave the academy, Sarah reflected on the broader implications of what had transpired. The confrontation with Morrison had been a catalyst for examining deep-seated problems, but the real victory lay in the systematic changes that followed. She thought about all the future officers who would graduate from an academy where character was valued as highly as competence, where diversity was seen as a strength rather than a burden, and where leadership was understood as service rather than privilege. The Navy would be stronger for it, and the nation would be safer. Sometimes the most important battles were fought not on distant seas, but in the hearts and minds of those entrusted with command. This had been one of those battles, and for once, Sarah felt confident that the right side had won.